Think your life is hard? You wouldn't last a single day as a widow on the frontier. Modern protections have made us soft. What happened to widows in the Wild West would shock you. Forget romantic notions of independent pioneer women. When your husband died, you had days, maybe weeks before men started circling like vultures. And they weren't offering sympathy. Between 1850 and 1900, roughly 20% of frontier women were widowed before age 35. Most remarried within 6 months, not by choice, but because the alternative was starvation or worse. This is the brutal reality of what happened when a woman lost her husband on the frontier. Let's start with the most disturbing truth: men proposing at funerals. This wasn't rare. This was standard practice. Your husband would be dead less than 24 hours and men would already be approaching you about remarriage. Some didn't even wait for the funeral to end. One diary from 1867 describes a widow in Montana who received 3 marriage proposals before her husband's body was cold. The men weren't being respectful or giving her time to grieve. They were making business transactions. A widow with land, a cabin, or livestock was valuable property, and they wanted to claim her before someone else did. The proposals weren't romantic. They were blunt negotiations. "I'll take care of you and the children if you marry me by Sunday." That was considered a generous offer. Many proposals were even more transactional, essentially demanding the widow hand over her property in exchange for basic survival. Women who refused these immediate proposals faced intense social pressure. The community would whisper that she was being foolish, prideful, or worse. Neighbors would suggest she was trying to survive alone to attract better offers. The judgment was relentless. Age gaps were extreme and expected. A 25-year-old widow with young children might marry a 60-year-old man because he had a stable farm. A 40-year-old widow might marry a 70-year-old because he needed someone to care for him before he died, and she needed shelter for the winter. These weren't marriages. They were survival contracts. Love had nothing to do with it. Many widows married men they'd met once or twice, or complete strangers who'd heard about their situation and traveled to propose. The worst part was that refusing meant facing something even more terrifying: winter alone. Winter widows faced a special kind of hell. If your husband died in late fall or early winter, you were trapped. There was no leaving, no traveling to family back east, no options until spring thaw. You were stuck in a cabin, often miles from the nearest neighbor, with dwindling supplies and no way to get more. Starvation was common. A widow with children would ration food carefully, giving most of it to the kids while she slowly starved. By spring, rescue parties would sometimes find cabins with dead mothers and barely alive children who'd survived by eating leather, tree bark, or worse. The isolation drove many women mad. Imagine spending 5 months alone in a tiny cabin, knowing your husband's body is buried just outside with no one to talk to except young children. No radio, no books, nothing but silence and cold, and the constant fear that you won't make it to spring. Some widows didn't make it mentally, even if they survived physically. Spring rescue parties would find women who'd lost their minds, unable to speak or recognize other humans. Children would be caring for mothers who'd become completely unresponsive. One account from Wyoming in 1879 describes finding a widow who'd been alone all winter with 3 children. She'd stopped speaking in January and spent the rest of winter sitting in a chair staring at nothing. The children had kept themselves alive by melting snow and eating the last of the dried beans. The cold itself was a killer. Keeping a fire going 24 hours a day for months required constant wood chopping. A woman alone couldn't keep up with the demand. Many froze to death in their own cabins because they simply ran out of fuel. For those who survived winter or whose husbands died in warmer months, the survival options were all brutal. Let's be clear about what choices a frontier widow actually had, because none of them were good. Taking in boarders was dangerous. You'd rent a room or bed to miners, cowboys, or drifters passing through. This meant having strange men in your home with your children. Assault was common. Murder wasn't unheard of, but it was income, and income meant survival. Washing laundry for mining camps was back-breaking labor that destroyed your hands and back. You'd haul water heated over fire, scrub clothes by hand for hours, then haul the wet laundry to dry. For this, you might earn a few dollars a week, barely enough to buy flour and beans. Cooking for work crews meant feeding dozens of hungry men 3 meals a day. The hours were brutal, the pay was minimal, and the men often expected more than just food. Saying no could mean losing your job and your only income. Then there was prostitution. For many widows, especially those with no skills, no property, and children to feed, this became the only option. Frontier towns were full of desperate women who'd never imagined they'd end up in brothels, but starvation makes decisions for you. The judgment from society was harsh. Women who turned to prostitution were shunned even though everyone knew they'd been forced into it by circumstances. Their children were bullied and excluded. There was no sympathy, only condemnation. Returning east was admitting failure, and most widows couldn't afford the journey anyway. The trip cost money they didn't have, and going back meant returning as a burden to family who might not want them. Many chose to stay and suffer rather than face that humiliation. Some widows tried to work their homesteads alone, but this was nearly impossible. Farming required strength and skills that most women hadn't developed. Plowing fields, repairing equipment, managing livestock. These were tasks designed for men's physical capabilities. The legal situation made everything worse. In many territories, widows couldn't legally own property. When your husband died, his land claim could be contested or simply taken. You had no legal standing to fight back. If your husband hadn't completed the homestead requirements, you couldn't prove up the claim alone. The land would revert to the government, and you'd lose everything you'd worked for. Years of labor gone overnight because you didn't have a husband to sign the papers. Children's inheritance was regularly stolen by male relatives. A dead man's brother or father could show up and claim legal guardianship of the children, taking control of any property or money. The widow had no say. Courts sided with male relatives almost automatically. Even if you technically owned property, you couldn't conduct business without a man's signature in many places. Selling livestock, buying supplies, taking out loans, all required male approval. You were treated as incompetent simply because you were a woman. Claim jumpers specifically targeted widows. They knew a woman alone couldn't defend her property. They'd move onto her land, threaten her and her children, and dare her to do something about it. Local law enforcement rarely helped. The attitude was that a woman alone didn't deserve to keep valuable land anyway. One widow in Colorado in 1881 had her entire herd of cattle stolen by neighboring ranchers who simply claimed the animals had wandered onto their property. She had no legal recourse. The sheriff told her she should have remarried if she wanted to keep her livestock. Then there was what locals called the widow tax, though it wasn't official. It was the community's expectation that widows owed them free labor and favors in exchange for basic survival. Need help fixing your roof? Better cook dinner for the men who help? Need someone to plow your field? Better be prepared to wash their clothes for free? Need supplies on credit? The merchant might suggest alternative payment methods that had nothing to do with money. Men in the community felt entitled to a widow's labor and often her body. The assumption was that a woman without a husband was available for any man's use. Refusing advances could mean being cut off from community support entirely. Merchants regularly overcharged widows because they knew the women had no choice but to pay. A bag of flour that cost a married woman $2 might cost a widow $3. She couldn't shop elsewhere because there was nowhere else to shop. The lack of male protection meant constant exploitation. Every transaction, every interaction, every request for help came with strings attached. Nothing was free, and the price was always higher for a woman alone. Some communities were more supportive, but these were rare. Most frontier towns operated on harsh survival logic. Resources were limited, and a widow with children was seen as a drain rather than a community member deserving help. The children of widows faced their own nightmare. Families were regularly torn apart because a widow couldn't feed all her children. Older children were hired out as labor to other families. This was called placing out, but it was essentially selling your children. A 10-year-old boy might be sent to work on a ranch, a 12-year-old girl sent to work as a domestic servant. The widow would receive a small payment or just the relief of one less mouth to feed. These children often never saw their mothers again. Once placed with another family, they became that family's property, essentially. Many were abused, overworked, and treated as slaves rather than employees. Younger children were sent to orphanages if there were any nearby, which there usually weren't. More commonly, they were sent east on orphan trains shipped to cities where they'd be adopted by strangers. Mothers had no say in who took their children or where they ended up. Siblings were split up. A widow might keep one child while sending the others away, choosing based on who was most useful or who she could afford to feed. The psychological trauma of these decisions destroyed women. One account from Kansas describes a widow who kept her youngest daughter but sent her 3 sons to different ranches as workers. She never saw 2 of them again. The third returned 10 years later and she didn't recognize him. Children who stayed with their widowed mothers were forced to work like adults. 8-year-olds would be doing farm labor, hunting for food, or caring for younger siblings while their mothers worked. Childhood didn't exist for these kids. The remarriage market treated widows like livestock at auction. A widow's value was calculated based on what she brought to the marriage. Land children who could work youth health and skills. Widows with property were pursued aggressively. Men didn't care about the woman herself. They wanted her land, her cabin, her livestock. The marriage was just the legal mechanism to take possession. Once married, everything she owned became his property automatically. These marriages were often abusive. A man who married for property had no emotional investment in his new wife. She was a means to an end. Beatings were common. Neglect was standard. Some men worked their new wives to death, then looked for another widow to marry. Stepchildren were frequently mistreated. A new husband saw his wife's children as burdens or free labor. Many stepfathers were openly cruel, and mothers had no power to protect their children. Leaving the marriage meant losing everything and returning to destitution. Some men married elderly widows just to inherit their property when they died. This was an accepted practice. A 30-year-old man might marry a 70-year-old widow, wait for her to die, then inherit everything. The widow got care in her final years and he got property. Everyone understood the transaction. Widows without property had almost no remarriage prospects unless they were very young and attractive. A 40-year-old widow with no land and several children was considered unmarriageable. Her options were limited to the survival methods we discussed earlier. The age gap marriages created their own problems. A young widow married to an elderly man would likely be widowed again within years, restarting the entire nightmare cycle. Some women were widowed 3 or 4 times, each time losing everything and starting over. The immediate crisis after a husband's death was overwhelming. One day you're a married woman with legal protections and social standing, the next day you're a widow with nothing. You couldn't make legal decisions, you couldn't access bank accounts without mail approval. Any debts your husband owed became your responsibility, but any money he'd saved might be claimed by his relatives. The legal system was designed to strip widows of everything. The homestead still needed work. Animals needed feeding. Crops needed tending. Repairs needed making. All of this fell on you immediately with no transition period. If you couldn't keep up, you'd lose everything within weeks. Claim jumpers and con men descended on new widows like locusts. They'd offer to help with legal matters, then steal property through fraudulent contracts. Widows who couldn't read were especially vulnerable to these schemes. Neighbors who'd been friendly when your husband was alive suddenly became distant. A widow was a social problem. She might need help, might need charity, might become a burden. Many communities simply waited for widows to leave or die rather than offering real support. The statistics paint a grim picture of just how common and brutal this experience was. Between 1850 and 1900, frontier life was so dangerous that widowhood was almost expected. The average frontier marriage lasted only about 15 years before one spouse died, usually the husband. Accidents, disease, violence, and harsh conditions killed men at alarming rates. Mining accidents, farming injuries, shootings, and simple infections that would be minor today were death sentences then. Childbirth killed many women, but men died more frequently from the dangerous work they did. A woman in her 30s had a very high chance of being widowed at least once. Many women buried 2 or 3 husbands during their lifetimes. Life expectancy after widowhood was short. The stress, poverty, and brutal labor killed women quickly. A woman widowed at 30 might be dead herself by 40, worn out from trying to survive alone in impossible conditions. Children of widows had significantly higher mortality rates than children in 2-parent families. Malnutrition, lack of medical care, and dangerous living conditions killed them at shocking rates. A widow might lose half her children within a year of her husband's death. There were rare success stories. Some widows managed to keep their homesteads and build successful lives. A few became businesswomen running boarding houses, restaurants, or shops. These women became legends in their communities precisely because they were so unusual. One famous example is Eleanor Pruitt Stewart, who homesteaded alone in Wyoming after being widowed. She wrote letters describing her experiences that were later published, but her story was remarkable because it was so rare. For every success story, there were hundreds of widows who died in poverty and obscurity. The women who succeeded usually had specific advantages: literacy, business skills, family support, or property that was already established and profitable. A widow starting from nothing had almost no chance of success. Most widows who tried to maintain independence eventually gave up and remarried out of sheer exhaustion. The constant struggle, the loneliness, the fear, and the physical demands were simply too much for one person to sustain. The few who made it became cautionary tales in a way. Other women would look at them and think, she's surviving, but look at what it's costing her. The successful widows were often worn down, aged beyond their years, and isolated from normal social life. By now, you're probably horrified by the reality of what frontier widows endured. This wasn't the romantic Wild West of movies and novels. This was a brutal system that treated women as property and widows as problems to be solved through remarriage or elimination. The women who survived weren't just strong. They were desperate, determined, and willing to endure things that would break most modern people. They married men they didn't love, sent their children away, worked themselves to exhaustion, and sacrificed everything just to survive another day. Next time you think about how hard your life is, remember that. Your great-great-grandmother might have buried a husband, lost her home, sent her children to strangers, and married a man twice her age just to avoid starving to death. We've gotten soft, and honestly, that's not a bad thing at all.